One of the reasons I love the early history of shotguns is how creative companies were forced to be. The idea of a pump action weapon wasn't protected by a patent. Winchester had even gone to court to prove it against claims made by the rights owner of the Spencer shotgun. Winchester went as far as to recreate an ancient pump action firearm to prove it. However, lots of different aspects of shotguns were patented. This meant you had to be creative, and the Stevens Model 520 was creative. If you're not a fan of deep diving into near autistic levels of patent history and uninformed speculation, you can skip this section. Good old John Browning had a hand in designing the 520. The man owned a lot of patents at the time, so he was working around the patents he licensed to companies like Winchester. I often joke that Winchester was actually just a patent office that just so happened to make guns on the side. Browning's M1893 and M1897 series of shotguns made pump action shotguns extremely popular. So everyone kind of wanted to produce one to kind of compete in that field. John Browning filed the first patent that would become the 520 on July 10th, 1903. And that's kind of an important date because in August of 1903, Winchester sent out the infamous Sour Grapes memo announcing and downplaying Browning's departure from Winchester. The Sour Grapes memo proclaimed that Winchester had purchased every patent Browning had produced while he was working with Winchester, even if they never intended to produce it. Yet, Winchester did not purchase this patent. To me, it's unlikely Browning would have designed a competitor to Winchester's pump gun if he wasn't on his way out. That's pure speculation, but I do find the timing interesting. J. Stevens Arms and Tool Company would purchase the patent rights for this design in 1907. I was browsing Browning patents, say that 5 times fast, and came across an 1897 patent for a shotgun loading tray. In the provided images, we see the distinct receiver shape of the 520, so this idea was apparently around since at least 1897. I'm not a patent attorney. Hell, I don't even watch many legal shows, except for Night Court, and not the remake, original only. However, the 1903 patent covers 3 features that would seem to separate the gun from the famed Winchester 1897. The first would be the breech block that locks into the top of the receiver and is visible through the receiver. When you move the action back and forth, you can see the breech block drop and rise, locking into the top of the receiver. Now, this design seems kind of quirky, but it was necessary to allow the second patent, a vertical takedown system, to be possible. Like pretty much all shotguns of this era, the 520 would be a takedown gun. The barrel and magazine tube would separate from the receiver to make a very compact package. The thing was is that they just couldn't use the same takedown design from the 1897 due to, patents. So the barrel and magazine would slide upward vertically into the receiver and are released and tightened by twisting the magazine tube. It's actually really neat, and when you look at it, it looks like it took a ton of machining to accomplish. The third feature would be the inertia lock. With most shotguns, you can manually pump the shotgun when the hammer is down without having to defeat any kind of locking system. That's not the case here. If you pull the trigger and the gun doesn't fire, you cannot manipulate the pump freely. This was a safety device, so if you attempted to shoot the gun and the gun didn't fire, the inertia lock kept the breech locked in case of a hang fire, which was likely much more common when using paper shells of the era. The user had to manually release the action. But if you pulled the trigger and the gun fired, the inertia lock was defeated and you could freely pump the gun. The force from a fired shell drives the inertia lock rearward to unlock the action. There was a second patent filed in 1907 concerning the slide arm and forend, and this would be the final piece to make the 528 reality. Outside of those features, the 520 is a fairly standard pump shotgun. It's got a 5-round tubular magazine, a wooden pump forend, and a wood stock. The gun loads from the bottom and ejects from the side. It's labeled as a hammerless gun, meaning the hammer sits concealed inside the receiver. On the left side of the gun, we have the pump release. It's rather large and round and easy to manipulate. However, I can't really manipulate it while in a firing position. Its placement on the left side of the receiver makes it difficult to reach and still hold the gun upright. The safety sits inside the trigger guard, and it's easy to see why such a design fell out of favor. It's just a little concerning to manipulate a safety that sits so close to the trigger. Guns like the M1 Garand have a safety inside the trigger guard, but this safety is literally right on top of the trigger, so I tended to not manipulate it with my trigger finger. Like most shotguns of this era, this gun can be slam fired. It's silly, but people like bump firing ARs, so I guess there's a small market for slam firing enthusiasts. The most distinct, eye-catching feature of the Stevens 520 is the double humpback style receiver. That's why I call this thing John Browning's other humpback shotgun. They were originally produced with 28 and 30-inch barrels, but whoever owned this model prior to me trimmed the barrel to make it a little shorter. Stevens did produce riot versions of this gun, but they are fairly rare. They also did prototype some trench models, but not very many. Reportedly, only one 520 trench gun still survives and was sold for way too many Heritage Rough Riders to count. So the gun's a little odd, but fairly unremarkable, until you start shooting it. The 520 can handle 2 3/4 inch shells, but it's wise to avoid both high velocity rounds and steel shot. Old shotguns don't play well with these modern loads. I only tend to shoot light loaded birdshot and Fiocchi buckshot through this gun. With that said, these are still pretty hefty guns and they're made from forged steel, so they can eat up recoil rather well, but I just really don't want to risk breaking such an old gun by shooting like a 1600 feet per second buckshot through it. The action is incredibly slick. The single action bar glides back and forth, ejecting cartridges smoothly and loading the next. Well, most of the time. Sadly, this gun has recently developed a problem with ejecting spent cases. I've had this gun for quite some time and it's never done this, so it's a rather new issue, and I'm glad it waited until I decided to make a video for it to appear. You can fly through multiple rounds quickly and easily when the gun wants to work. When it works, it eats rounds up and spits them out. It's clearly a well-made piece of machinery to last almost at least 100 years. It's not bad. Plus, when you look at the takedown procedure and the teeth and grooves that connect the barrel and magazine to the receiver, you can tell it wasn't a simple gun to produce by any means, especially with the machinery of the era. These are the kind of guns craftsmen really had to build. With the barrel trimmed, we've lost the choke, so it's a plain cylinder bore. The gun pattern's fine, but it's really decided more by your ammo than anything else. Now, if you look at the original models with the actual barrel that's not trimmed, the bead sight sits fairly high, kind of like how a Remington 870 has a bead that sits on a pedestal. That's not the case with my trimmed barrel. It sits low and directly on the barrel. This makes it appear to shoot high, so the point of aim, point of impact isn't copacetic. But that's really just a problem with my gun because it was, trimmed and someone didn't decide to set the bead high enough to work. Even with these issues, it's still one of the more enjoyable retro shotguns out there. It's slicker than you expect, and no one really seems to want these things, judging by how cheap they are. If you see one and it appears to be in good firing shape, I'd snatch it up. The 520 is a real joy to shoot when it wants to work anyway. Have you ever noticed that when you shoot an old gun, it just smells different? You get that smell with the 520. And that's kind of the end of what we would call a review, but I do want to talk about the 520 and its legacy, because it is a gun with many names, which also helps contribute to its low price or finding a 520 by a different name that's low priced. So I have a standard 520, but there are lots of incarnations of this gun. They changed model names based on the gun's grade. Guns like the 522, 525, 530, and 535 are all mechanically 520s. They just have varying levels of engravings, stock quality, and the option between a straight stock and a standard stock. Savage purchased Stevens in 1920 and made some changes to the design. They moved the slide release to the bottom of the gun, which is, much, much better. The Model 520A ditched the double humpback for a single humpback design, and then they moved the safety to the receiver tang, much like a Mossberg shotgun. The Model 620 came about in 1927, streamlining the receiver and eliminating the humpback for a rounded profile, which looks a hell of a lot lamer than the 520. Some variants of this gun have a safety inside the trigger guard, others have the safety as a crossbolt design sitting behind the trigger. The 620A came out in 1940, and all it really did was change how the stock connects to the receiver. As far as I can tell, if I'm wrong, please let me know. The 520-30 came out during World War II and was just a 520A with a different name. They produced trench and riot guns for military use, as well as long barrel guns for training. The Model 620A served alongside the 520-30 in these same configurations. These guns would remain in action during Korea and into the early days of Vietnam. Those are just the Stevens marked guns. The 520 was popular for department stores. They made various 520 and 620 guns under various names. This includes the Ranger Model 30, the Western Field Model 30, the Riverside Arms Model 520, and the J.C. Higgins 102.25, which I don't know how you pronounce that as a gun model. Now, these are all very solid guns, and as I said, no one really seems to want them or collect them, so they can be had for a little more than a single Heritage Rough Rider if you shop around. Of course, that could change with condition. Obviously, a mint condition model is going to go for a little bit more, but I don't think there's many mint condition examples of this gun out there. Now, these guns were produced for decades, but they were never a major success. They were kind of a moderate success. Stevens lacked the brand recognition of Winchester, and these guns were expensive and complicated to manufacture. In 1911, the 520 cost the same as the 1897. To me, the 520 is the better gun, but Winchester was an American icon. Competing with the big dog on the block was tough. If you couldn't offer something different and significantly better or significantly cheaper, you'd have a tough time succeeding. Good engineering just doesn't always beat iconic branding.